You know that feeling, right? That little spark of intuition, or maybe how your dog just knows you're about to grab the leash. It often feels like, well, like something more than just coincidence is going on.
Exactly. And these experiences, which often get dismissed, actually touch on some really deep scientific questions about how living things organize themselves, and maybe how information gets shared in ways we don't fully grasp yet.
So today, we're diving into a hypothesis that tries to tackle these very mysteries head on. It's definitely thought-provoking.
It really is. We're focusing on Rupert Sheldrake's concepts of morphic fields and morphic resonance. We're drawing from his work, like the Morphic Fields article in World Futures, some introductory essays, and a paper specifically looking at telepathy and the sense of being stared at.
And it's worth noting, right, that some of this comes from serious academic publishers like Routledge, Taylor, and Francis Group. So it's situated within that scholarly conversation, even if it's controversial.
Precisely. It's not just fringe speculation. It's engaging with scientific questions, albeit from a novel perspective.
So for you listening, why tune in? Well, think of this as getting a new lens, maybe a shortcut to understanding things that often feel inexplicable. It challenges standard scientific thinking, sure, but it might just click with some of your own experiences. You might have a real aha moment.
Our goal here is to really unpack these ideas. We'll start with the biological puzzle that got Sheldrake thinking in the first place, morphogenesis, how organisms get their shape. Then we'll dig into the morphic fields hypothesis itself, how it supposedly works.
And then we get into the really mind-bending stuff, morphic resonance, this idea of nature having a memory, and how it might connect to, believe it or not, quantum physics.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, we'll look at the evidence. What experiments have been done, what observations in biology, animal behavior, even human learning might support these ideas, including things like telepathy and that uncanny feeling of being watched.
Okay, let's start there then. The basic biological puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
How does life take shape?
Right. So Sheldrake started thinking about this seriously back when he was researching plant development at Cambridge. The question is fundamental. How does a simple seed or spore grow into, say, a complex orchid or massive redwood tree with all its specific structures? What directs that process? Biologists call it morphogenesis, the coming into being of form.
And the usual answer is, well, it's all in the genes, right? DNA is the blueprint.
That's the standard view, yes. But Sheldrake argues, and many developmental biologists would agree, that it's not quite that simple. The genetic code alone doesn't seem to be the whole story.
How so?
Well, think about it. Almost every cell in your body, your liver cells, your brain cells, your skin cells, they all contain the exact same set of genes, the same DNA blueprint. So if the genes were the only thing determining form, how do you end up with such radically different structures? Your arm and your leg, for example. Chemically, they're made of very similar stuff, proteins coded by the same genes. But their shapes, their functions, totally different. Genes tell the cell which proteins to make, but they don't seem to explicitly define the final three-dimensional architecture of a whole limb or organ.
So there's a gap between the genetic instructions and the final physical form.
Exactly. There seems to be something missing in that explanation, and that's where the idea of morphogenetic fields comes in these hypothesized invisible blueprints.
Invisible blueprints. That sounds a bit mystical.
Well, the term might sound that way, but the idea of fields guiding development isn't actually new. Biologists have talked about organizing fields or developmental fields since the 1920s. The concept is that there are regions of influence that shape the developing tissues and organs.
Okay, so it's not Sheldrake's original idea entirely.
The general concept of morphogenetic fields isn't, no. But what is novel, and where Sheldrake departs, is in proposing a specific nature and mechanism for these fields. Traditionally, biologists assumed these fields would eventually be explained by standard physics and chemistry, maybe complex molecular interactions.
But we still don't have that explanation.
Right. There's no consensus physical or chemical explanation for how these fields would actually work to shape an organism. Sheldrake's hypothesis attempts to fill that gap by suggesting something beyond conventional physics might be involved.
All right, so let's get into the hypothesis itself. What are morphic fields, according to Sheldrake?
He proposes that morphic fields are fundamental organizing fields found in and around all self-organizing systems. And this isn't just biology. It goes all the way from molecules and crystals up through cells, tissues, organisms, and even into animal societies and potentially human minds.
All self-organizing systems. That's
Wrong.
broad.
It is. He sees nature as structured in nested hierarchies, what Arthur Koestler called holarchies. Think atoms within molecules, molecules within cells, cells within tissues, and so on. Each level of organization, each whole, is proposed to have its own morphic field that gives it its characteristic properties and coordinates its parts. You can visualize it like layers of influence.
And you mentioned different kinds of fields earlier, not just for physical shape.
Correct. While morphogenetic fields are the ones specifically dealing with biological form, the hypothesis extends further. He talks about behavioral fields organizing instinct and learned behaviors, mental fields related to thoughts and cognition, and even social and cultural fields that shape the patterns in societies and traditions. They're all considered types of morphic fields.
Okay, so how are these fields supposed to actually do anything? How do they exert influence? The source mentioned probability, like quantum fields.
Yes, that's a key aspect. They aren't seen as deterministic machines imposing a rigid structure. Instead, they're thought to work probabilistically. They make certain outcomes more likely than others, nudging the system towards particular patterns out of a range of possibilities. It's like they impose order on underlying randomness or indeterminacy.
Give an example.
Protein folding is a good one. The gene dictates the sequence of amino acids, the protein's primary structure. But that chain can potentially fold up in countless ways.
Right.
The morphic field for that specific protein is proposed to guide the folding process, making the correct functional three-dimensional shape the most probable outcome among all the energetically possible configurations. It sort of channels the process towards the right structure.
And this idea of attractors fits in here, from René Thom.
Exactly. Thom's work in mathematics, specifically catastrophe theory, uses the concept of attractors to describe the stable endpoints or goals towards which dynamic systems tend to move. Sheldrake borrows this concept, suggesting that morphic fields contain these attractors. So the field doesn't just organize, it draws the system towards a specific goal or end state, whether that's the final form of an organ, a stable pattern of behavior, or even a particular thought pattern. It gives a scientific way to think about purpose or goal-directedness in nature.
Okay, organizing fields, probabilistic influence, attractors. Now we get to the really controversial part, morphic resonance, the memory of nature.
This is definitely the most radical and debated part of the hypothesis, yes. The idea here is that morphic fields aren't static. They contain a kind of built-in memory derived from all the similar systems that have existed in the past.
A memory.
Through repetition. The more times a particular pattern of organization, whether it's a crystal structure, a way a protein folds, or an animal's behavior has occurred, the stronger its influence becomes within the morphic field. This makes that pattern more likely to happen again in subsequent similar systems. It's like habits forming not just in individuals, but in nature itself. Sheldrake even speculates that the so-called laws of nature might just be incredibly ancient, deeply ingrained habits of the cosmos.
Wow, okay, so laws as habits. And morphic resonance is how this memory gets accessed.
Precisely. Morphic resonance is the proposed process by which this influence is transmitted. It's the transfer of patterns of activity or information from past systems to present similar systems.
Yeah.
And crucially, this influence is thought to occur across space and time without necessarily diminishing with distance.
No diminishing with distance. That sounds weird, like telepathy or something.
It does challenge our usual assumptions about cause and effect. The key factor determining the strength of the resonance isn't distance, but similarity. The more similar a current system is to previous systems, the more strongly it will resonate with them and tune into that collective history.
So every robin is somehow connected to all past robins, drawing on their collective experience of nest building or migrating.
That's the idea. Each individual taps into and contributes to a collective species-specific memory pool through morphic resonance. It's an inherent memory. Sheldrake himself points out the parallel to Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious in humans, this idea of shared, inherited archetypes and psychic patterns. Morphic resonance offers a potential biological mechanism for something like that.
If this is happening, shouldn't we see evidence of it everywhere? In physics, chemistry, biology?
You'd expect to, yes. The hypothesis predicts testable effects. However, detecting it might be tricky in very old established systems. Think fundamental particles or basic chemical reactions. Their morphic fields would be incredibly strong, ancient habits, making them look like fixed laws.
But maybe in newer systems, like that example of crystals.
Exactly, that's a classic example often cited. When chemists synthesize a brand new compound, getting it to crystallize for the first time can be really difficult and take ages.
Right, I've heard that.
The standard explanations involve needing microscopic seed crystals to start the process, or just figuring out the right conditions through trial and error. But the observation is that often, once a compound has been crystallized somewhere in the world, subsequent attempts to crystallize it elsewhere seem to get easier over time. Morphic resonance provides an alternative explanation. The first crystals establish a morphic field for that specific crystal structure. Through resonance, this field then makes it easier for the same structure to form later, even in different labs under controlled conditions where contamination by physical seeds is ruled out. The more it crystallizes, the stronger the field, the easier it gets. It's circumstantial, but suggestive.
This idea of influence across space, not depending on distance. It does start to sound a bit like some of the weirdness in quantum physics, doesn't it? Non-locality.
There are definite conceptual parallels, and Sheldrake and others have pointed them out. Quantum mechanics famously includes non-locality, the spooky action at a distance that Einstein was so uncomfortable with, where entangled particles seem instantly connected regardless of how far apart they are.
And experiments have shown that's real, right?
Yes, experimental tests, like those based on Bell's theorem, have repeatedly confirmed quantum non-locality. So the idea of non-local connections isn't totally alien to physics, at least at the quantum level.
Have mainstream physicists engaged with Sheldrake's ideas on this?
Some prominent ones have, yes. People like David Bohm, whose theory of the implicate order involves a deep underlying interconnectedness, found Sheldrake's ideas very resonant. John Bell also expressed interest. More recently, physicists like Amit Goswami and Hans-Peter Durer have explored potential links. And Ervin Laszlo's concept of the Akashic field, a kind of universal memory field in the quantum vacuum, is sometimes seen as related.
But it's not like there's a unified theory connecting morphic fields and quantum mechanics yet.
Oh, absolutely not. That's a crucial caveat. While the parallels are intriguing, applying quantum principles directly to large, complex, warm, wet systems like brains or whole organisms is incredibly difficult and not well understood. So the exact relationship, if any, between morphic fields and quantum physics is still very much an open question, highly speculative.
Okay, let's pivot to the evidence claimed for morphic resonance, especially in biology and learning. You mentioned it's testable.
Yes. And a key prediction is that habits should build up over time, across generations. That fruit fly experiment is an early example. Remember, exposing eggs to ether vapor caused some flies to develop 4 wings instead of 2.
Yeah.
The interesting part was that over generations of doing this, the percentage of 4-winged flies increased, even in later generations not directly exposed to the ether. It suggested the developmental habit of growing 4 wings became easier for the population to fall into, possibly via morphic resonance.
And what about animal behavior? The
Yeah.
cattle guards.
Yes, the painted cattle guards. A fascinating observation. Ranchers noticed cattle would often avoid simple stripes painted on the road just as they'd avoid actual cattle guards, the metal grids.
But how would they know? Especially young ones.
That's the puzzle. You'd assume they learn by watching older cows or having a bad experience. But studies, like those by Ted Friend at Texas A&M, seem to show that even naive cattle, who'd never seen a real or painted guard before, sometimes showed this avoidance. It's as if they were tapping into a species memory of, don't walk on that pattern. Similar things have been noted with sheep and horses.
And the rats in the water maze. That sounds more controlled.
It does. These were experiments repeated in different labs over decades. The consistent finding was that later generations of rats learned to escape a specific water maze faster than earlier generations had. Again, morphic resonance offers an explanation. The first rats established a maze escape field, and subsequent rats tuned into it, making learning easier worldwide.
How might this apply to us, to human learning? Does it mean learning calculus gets easier because so many people have already done it?
Potentially, yes. The hypothesis suggests that learning anything that many others have learned before should be, on average, slightly easier because you can tap into that collective field. Think about language acquisition in children. Linguists like Chomsky and Pinker talk about the incredible speed and creativity kids show, suggesting an innate language faculty, not just imitation. Morphic resonance could offer a mechanism for inheriting that kind of linguistic structure or predisposition.
And the Flynn effect, that's the one about rising IQ scores over decades, right?
Exactly. Average scores on standardized IQ tests rose steadily throughout much of the 20th century across many countries. It's a well-documented but puzzling phenomenon. James Flynn himself called it baffling. Standard explanations like better nutrition or schooling don't seem to fully account for the scale or pattern of the rise.
So the morphic resonance idea is...
The idea is that as millions upon millions of people took these specific tests, they collectively built up a strong morphic field for how to do well on IQ tests. Subsequent test takers resonate with this field, making the tests themselves effectively easier to navigate, even if underlying intelligence hasn't changed quite as dramatically. It's an alternative perspective on a real puzzle.
Okay, this is taking us towards groups and social connections. The idea that morphic fields could link members of a social group. That sounds like it could lead towards explaining things like telepathy.
That's precisely the connection Sheldrake makes. If morphic fields organize groups, perhaps they also act as channels for communication beyond the ordinary senses. Think about the incredible coordination in a termite colony building a complex mound, or a flock of birds turning in perfect unison, or a school of fish moving as one entity. Our current understanding of sensory communication doesn't always fully explain this level of synchronization. Shared morphic fields could be involved.
And the link to telepathy is strongest between individuals with close bonds.
That's the suggestion, yes. Telepathy, literally distant feeling, often seems to involve communicating needs, intentions, or distress between individuals who are emotionally close, even when separated by distance. Think of sudden anxieties that match a loved one having an accident miles away, or vivid dreams.
Or pets seeming to know things. That's where Sheldrake has focused a lot of research, right?
Yes, he argues that telepathy between humans and domesticated animals is a really promising area because the bonds are often very strong and animals aren't as likely to rationalize or dismiss unusual experiences. His book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Were Coming Home, is full of examples based on thousands of reports from pet owners.
Reports like,
Things like pets anticipating vet visits before any obvious clues, or knowing when a specific person is about to take them for a walk, even if the person just formed the intention silently in another room. He uses the analogy of quantum entanglement, that non-local connection, to help conceptualize how such communication might be possible.
but science has historically been very skeptical of telepathy.
Extremely skeptical. For a long time, it was basically taboo, dismissed as superstition or fraud. There was no plausible mechanism within the standard mechanistic worldview. Morphic fields, however, offer a potential testable mechanism rooted in biology.
So what about the experiments with pets? Like the dogs knowing when owners are coming home?
That was a key claim that emerged from the anecdotal reports. Many owners insisted their pets anticipated their return, sometimes waiting by the door 10-15 minutes before they arrived, even when arrival times were irregular.
And he tested this experimentally.
Yes, extensively. They set up VO cameras recording the pets at home while the owners were miles away. The owners would decide to return at randomly selected times and often traveled home in unfamiliar vehicles, like taxis, to rule out cues like engine sounds.
And the results?
The results, documented over hundreds of trials, showed that dogs in particular often did show anticipatory behavior, going to wait by the window or door significantly more often during the period when their owner had formed the intention to return and was actually on their way, compared to control periods when the owner wasn't coming home. The interpretation is that the dogs were responding telepathically to the owner's intention.
That's pretty remarkable if true. He also mentioned animal navigation.
Right. The incredible journeys of migrating birds or salmon returning to their spawning grounds, or pets finding their way home over vast distances. These are still largely mysterious. Morphic fields are proposed as a possible factor, perhaps acting like invisible elastic bands connecting animal to its home, with home being an attractor in the field.
What about human telepathy? Is there lab evidence beyond anecdotes?
There is lab evidence from parapsychology research using things like Ganzfeld protocols or remote viewing tasks. Meta-analyses often show small but statistically significant effects, suggesting information transfer beyond sensory channels. However, the effects are often weak and hard to replicate consistently.
Why might that be?
Well, one possible reason, from the morphic field perspective, is that lab experiments usually use strangers. If telepathy works best through established social bonds, you wouldn't expect strong effects between random participants.
Which brings us back to things like knowing who's calling on the phone. Lots of people report that feeling.
Exactly. That feeling of thinking of someone just before they call or knowing who it is before you look at the caller ID, it's a common modern anecdote. And Sheldrake designed experiments to test this, specifically telephone telepathy.
How did those work?
They were quite clever. A participant would nominate, say, 4 people they knew well, close friends or family. Then, at a set time, the experimenter would randomly choose one of those 4 people and ask them to call the participant. Before the caller spoke, the participant simply had to guess which of the 4 nominated people was calling. By chance, they'd be right 25% of the time.
What do they find?
Across hundreds of trials, the average success rate was consistently around 42%, significantly above the 25% chance level, with astronomical odds against it being just luck.
Wow.
And interestingly, the success rate was even higher, about 56%, when the callers were people the participant felt particularly close to, compared to more casual acquaintances where the results were closer to chance. This supports the idea that social bonds matter.
Can distance make a difference?
Apparently not. They ran trials with participants and callers separated by huge distances, UK to Australia, for example, and the success rates remained significantly above chance. He's also done similar work looking at email telepathy.
This all seems to point towards the idea that our minds aren't just locked inside our skulls, this extended mind concept.
Exactly. That's the philosophical implication Sheldrake draws. The standard view in neuroscience is that mind equals brain activity, confined within the head. But he argues that this leads to absurdities. If all perception happens inside the brain, then logically the physical skull must be outside everything you perceive, which makes no sense.
So the alternative is?
The alternative is that perception happens where it seems to happen out there in the world. He proposes that our minds extend outwards through perceptual fields. Vision, for instance, isn't just light coming in. It also involves an outward projection of our awareness, our mind reaching out to touch what we see. If you're looking at a star, your mind, via its perceptual field, extends to that star.
Perceptual fields as a type of morphic field.
Yes. And if our minds reach out like this, then our attention and intention might actually have subtle effects on what we are looking at, which provides a potential explanation for.
The sense of being stared at, that feeling someone's looking at your back.
Right. An incredibly common experience surveys show over 90% of people report feeling it. If your mind is strictly in your head, there's no reason you should be able to detect an unseen gaze. But if minds extend outwards, maybe the focused attention of someone looking at you creates a detectable influence via these fields.
Has this been tested experimentally too?
Yes, using very simple setups. Someone sits blindfolded, and another person behind them either stares intently at the back of their neck or looks away in a random sequence. The blindfolded person just has to guess looking or not looking for each trial.
And the results?
Overwhelmingly positive and statistically significant across tens, even hundreds of thousands of trials conducted worldwide. People seem genuinely able to tell when they're being stared at well above chance levels. And intriguingly, the effect seems to persist even when the staring is done via closed-circuit TV.
Maybe an evolutionary thing. Predator detection.
That's one suggestion. An evolved sensitivity to being watched could definitely be advantageous for survival.
So wrapping this part up, the argument is that if we accept the idea of extended minds linked by fields, things like telepathy and being stared at, shift from being paranormal to being, well, maybe just normal aspects of our biology that we don't fully understand yet.
Precisely. They become expected consequences of this view of mind and nature rather than impossible anomalies. The brain is still crucial, the hub, but maybe not the absolute container of the mind. It's a view that emphasizes interconnectedness rather than isolation within our skulls. And the implications could ripple out understanding cultural transmission, maybe even how scientific ideas themselves catch on.
But the source did mention a key limitation, right, about creativity.
Yes, that's important. Morphic resonance explains the repetition of patterns, how habits form, how structures are maintained. It doesn't by itself explain where new patterns come from in the first place. How does evolutionary novelty arise? How was the first eye formed or the first instance of a new behavior?
So it explains inheritance, but not necessarily invention.
Exactly. Sheldrake acknowledges this. His hypothesis deals with causation based on repetition, not origin. He notes it's compatible with various ideas about creativity, whether it's random mutation and selection, some inherent creativity in nature, or even other philosophical or theological views.
But telepathy and the staring sense, those seem to flow quite directly from the core ideas of extended minds and morphic fields.
They do seem to be more direct consequences of the main hypothesis, yes, compared to some other phenomena sometimes grouped under the psi umbrella, which might require additional assumptions.
Okay, so let's try to pull the main threads together. We've looked at morphic fields as these proposed organizing patterns in nature, shaping everything from molecules to minds.
And morphic resonance as the mechanism for a kind of natural memory, where past systems' influence present similar ones across space and time, making habits form and potentially explaining things like instinct and collective learning.
Which leads to this challenging but intriguing idea of the extended mind, that our consciousness isn't strictly brain-bound, but reaches out. connecting us to the world and each other through perceptual and other fields.
Offering potential explanations for phenomena like morphogenesis, animal navigation, maybe even the Flynn effect, and certainly providing a framework where telepathy and the sense of being stared at become biologically plausible rather than impossible.
It's definitely a framework that challenges conventional thinking, but offers a potentially unified way to look at a lot of otherwise disconnected mysteries.
It does. It suggests a far more interconnected and remembering universe than the standard mechanistic picture allows. A different view of life, consciousness, and how we relate to everything around us.
So, a final thought for you listening. If our minds do extend beyond our brains, if we are interconnected through these subtle fields, constantly influenced by the past experiences of our species and even the planet, how does that change things?
How might it alter your understanding of your own intuition, your connection to others, to animals, to the environment?
Could those aha moments, those sudden insights, be glimpses of this deeper connection, a resonance with collective knowledge? What other experiences in your life might look different through this lens?
It certainly invites you to look again at the world and yourself with a sense of wonder and perhaps a greater appreciation for the potential mysteries still waiting to be understood. We definitely encourage exploring Rupert Sheldrake's work further if this has piqued your interest.